All right, welcome to your very own deep dive. You sent over some pretty thought-provoking stuff from Noam Chomsky and Nathan J. Robinson from their book, The Myth of American Idealism.
Yeah.
And we're excited to dive into it with this book. It really takes on some of those common stories we hear about U.S. foreign policy, arguing that it's driven a lot more by just raw power than by, all those good intentions that we hear so much about.
It's fascinating how they really systematically go through this idea of, American exceptionalism, this kind of, this idea that American foreign policy is always, for the greater good, and they really start to deconstruct that.
Yeah, right from the start, they remind us that every empire in history claims that their actions are for some higher purpose.
Of course.
But the reality is often much darker when you look at the actual impacts.
Exactly.
And one of the things that really struck me was this idea of the fifth freedom that Chomsky talks about.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that a little bit?
Absolutely. So, we have the traditional four freedoms, speech, religion, freedom from want, freedom from fear.
Yeah, those classic words.
The classic ones. But Chomsky argues that there's this unspoken fifth freedom.
Okay.
Which is the freedom to dominate.
Right.
The freedom to maintain this kind of global privilege. And he said this often overrides the other four freedoms that the U.S. claims to champion.
So it's not just about power for power's sake. It's tied to something deeper.
Yeah, it's about protecting those economic interests.
Right.
It's about securing resources.
Okay.
It's about maintaining that kind of top dog position in this globalized world.
And one of the examples that they use to really illustrate this, I think, really well is the case of British Guiana in the 1960s.
Right.
It just seems like such a textbook example of what they're talking about.
It really is. I mean, you have this democratically elected leader with socialist leanings.
Right.
And the U.S., fearing another Cuba situation, steps in covertly to undermine him.
Yeah.
And they orchestrate this campaign to destabilize the country through the CIA.
Wow.
It ultimately leads to economic ruin and this intense racial conflict.
And what's really striking is that this tiny little country posed no military threat to the United States at all.
Not at all.
It seems like it was purely about preventing any potential challenge to their influence in the region.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It was about sending a message that you don't mess with the U.S.'s economic and political dominance.
Even if you're democratically elected.
Exactly.
Even if you're,
even if your goals
trying to help your own people
are to improve the lives of your people.
Right.
Yeah, and this fear of these what they call nationalistic regimes.
Right. And they use that term a lot. Nationalistic regime.
Well, they use it because that's how the U.S. frames it.
Right.
It's this way to demonize any government that resists U.S. influence, even if that government is genuinely trying to improve the lives of its people.
Yeah, on the surface, it sounds like a good thing.
Right.
Putting your nation first.
Precisely.
But they're saying that's a way to kind of twist the narrative.
Exactly.
Make U.S. intervention seem justified.
Yeah, make it seem like they're the good guys. Right. Even when they're really just trying to maintain control.
And they point to this 1954 National Security Council document as evidence.
Yes.
It lays out U.S. goals in Latin America. And it's striking because there's no mention of democracy or human rights.
It's all about creating a favorable environment for private enterprise, attracting foreign investment, and building up militaries that are friendly to the U.S.
So it's really laying bare that economic motivation.
Exactly. It's all about protecting U.S. interests.
And they bring up Nicaragua as a really stark example of this. You've got the Carter administration propping up Somoza.
Right, this brutal dictator.
Yeah, despite his terrible human rights record. And then under Reagan, the U.S. actively wages war against the Sandinistas, who overthrew Somoza. And were actually trying to implement social programs.
Exactly. They were trying to improve the lives of the people.
Yeah.
And the U.S. saw that as a threat.
So it's like they want stability, but they're also destabilizing a country.
That's the contradiction
trying to make progress.
Of U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah.
They want stability,
Right.
but only on their own terms.
Only if it benefits them.
Exactly.
And then there's the Indonesian massacre of 1965.
Oh, yeah.
Which is just this horrifying example.
That's a dark chapter.
It's really hard to fathom that the U.S., backed this mass killing of suspected communists. Yeah. And that it was actually celebrated in the media.
Yeah, as a victory for the free world.
Yeah. It's just a really disturbing example of how,
All right.
ideology and the pursuit of U.S. interests can be used to justify even the most horrific acts.
Yeah, and it really shows how the U.S. picks and chooses when it wants to apply its ideals.
Right.
What matters is serving those U.S. interests, whoever's committing the violence.
And it makes you question, how much of what we're told about U.S. foreign policy is actually true, and how much is just carefully crafted to make us feel good about our country's actions.
That's exactly the point they're trying to make.
Right.
They want us to think critically, to question those assumptions, to look at the evidence for ourselves.
And that brings us to Vietnam. Yeah. A war that's often portrayed as this, tragic mistake.
With this noble cause gone wrong.
Right.
But Chomsky and Robinson present a very different perspective. They argue that the Vietnam War was not a mistake at all, but a deliberate act of aggression driven by fear of losing face and control in Southeast Asia.
So they're saying that the U.S. was fully aware of the suffering it was causing and that its South Vietnamese allies were deeply unpopular. Yeah. But they kept escalating the war?
They did.
Even when it was clear they couldn't win.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Chomsky and Robinson argue it's because the U.S. was obsessed with maintaining its image as this global superpower.
They had to win at all costs.
Exactly, even if it meant sacrificing countless lives. And
they quote from the Pentagon Papers, which basically says the U.S. war aims were 70% to avoid humiliation, 20% to keep South Vietnam out of Chinese hands, and only 10% to actually help the South Vietnamese people.
That's telling.
It's a pretty stark admission that, the well-being of the Vietnamese people was not really a priority.
It was a distant third.
Yeah.
Behind U.S. interests.
It really underscores that point that, the U.S. is willing to prioritize its own interests, even at the expense of human life.
And that pattern continues into the 21st century.
With the Iraq War.
With the Iraq War.
Yeah, I mean, those justifications for the war, the whole WMD thing.
All those claims about WMDs have been completely debunked. Yeah. It's clear now that it was a war based on lies and manipulation.
Yeah, it's really disturbing how they were able to sell that war to the public with such blatant dishonesty.
Yeah, they really highlight the role of propaganda and how it's used to shape public perception.
And it makes you wonder, how much of what we're told is actually true.
Especially when those in power are so determined to manipulate us.
And they bring up Colin Powell's presentation to the UN.
Oh, yeah.
Where he claimed to have all this evidence of WMDs that we now know was completely fabricated.
Yeah.
It's just mind-boggling.
It's a classic example of how easily we can be misled when those in power are willing to lie to us.
And even though the Bush administration talks about using pinpoint strikes, to minimize civilian casualties, the reality on the ground was very different.
It was brutal.
Chomsky and Robinson document all these atrocities committed by U.S. forces.
Yeah, they talk about the bombing of civilian shelters, attacks on retreating soldiers, even burying Iraqi troops alive.
God.
It's hard to reconcile those actions with this image of the U.S. as a force for good.
Yeah. And the irony is that the Iraq War, which was supposed to fight terrorism, actually ended up making it worse.
Yeah, it created more instability, more resentment, more breeding grounds for extremist groups.
And they argue that the real goal was to further U.S. geopolitical goals.
Yeah, things like controlling Iraqi oil. They even quote Alan Greenspan, who said the war was largely about oil.
So again, it's about those interests. Exactly. Yeah. It's about power and profit.
Not about liberating anyone.
Nope.
And that brings us to the U.S. relationship with Israel and Palestine. Which is another area where they're very critical.
Very critical of the U.S. policy.
They argue that the U.S. bears responsibility for Israeli actions. Because of its unwavering support, both financially and diplomatically.
And that's a perspective you don't often hear in mainstream discussions.
They're really challenging the conventional wisdom.
They go so far as to say that the U.S. is complicit
Yes.
in Israeli crimes, essentially turning them into U.S.-Israeli crimes.
Yeah, they use very strong language to emphasize their point.
It's a powerful statement.
It is.
And one that's sure to ruffle some feathers.
Oh, absolutely. They're deliberately trying to provoke a reaction.
And they trace this back to the very beginning of the Zionist movement, arguing that the idea of creating a Jewish state inherently involved dispossessing the Palestinian population.
They point out that some early Zionist leaders openly acknowledge this.
That creating a Jewish state would require removing the existing Arab population.
Exactly.
And again, that's a perspective you don't often hear.
It challenges the dominant narrative about the conflict.
It's a different way of looking at the history.
Exactly. And they provide a lot of evidence to show how the U.S. has supported Israeli actions that have resulted in the displacement and suffering of Palestinians.
Things like the demolition of homes.
Yes, the expansion of settlements, the blockade of Gaza, the use of excessive force against civilians.
And all of this is happening with U.S. complicity.
That's their argument. They say the U.S. is not a neutral observer, but an active participant, enabling and supporting these actions.
It's a tough pill to swallow.
It is, but it's a perspective that I think is worth considering.
And it seems like we're seeing a similar pattern play out with China.
Very similar. Chomsky and Robinson argue that the U.S. is doing the same thing with China. They're trying to contain its rise and maintain that global dominance.
So they're saying that the U.S. sees China as a threat.
A threat to its hegemony.
To their position at the top.
Exactly.
And we see this in the military buildup.
Yeah, the U.S. is increasing its military presence in the region. Conducting provocative military exercises.
Like Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan.
Exactly. That was a major provocation.
And it seems like they're unwilling to pursue any kind of diplomatic solutions.
Right. They're not interested in compromise.
That might benefit both sides.
They want to dictate the terms.
It's a dangerous game.
It is a very dangerous game.
Yeah, it really increases the risk of conflict.
It does. And they see this as a classic case of what's called the Thucydides trap. Where a rising power threatens to displace a ruling power. And that often leads to war.
So you've got these two superpowers kind of on a collision course.
And they're both heavily armed.
And then there's the war in Ukraine, which is obviously triggered by Russian aggression.
Yes.
But Chomsky and Robinson argue that U.S. policy also played a role.
They argue that the U.S. pushed too far with NATO expansion, essentially dismissing Russia's security concerns.
And they point out that Russia warned the U.S. about the consequences.
For years.
But the U.S. ignored those warnings.
They did. They were determined.
It's a reminder that actions have consequences.
Yes, actions have consequences.
And that even well-intentioned policies can have unintended outcomes.
Absolutely.
And then they point out that some in the U.S. have actually benefited from this war.
Yeah, the arms industry, for example. They've seen a huge surge in profits.
It makes you wonder if some people are actually motivated to prolong the conflict.
It's a cynical view, but it's hard to ignore.
And of course, we can't talk about U.S. foreign policy without talking about nuclear weapons.
Right, the ultimate threat.
Chomsky and Robinson are very critical of U.S. nuclear policy.
They see it as reckless and immoral.
They point out that the U.S., despite all its talk about peace and security, has a long history of nuclear brinksmanship.
They bring up the Cuban Missile Crisis as a prime example.
Where they say U.S. actions actually contributed to the crisis.
They pushed Khrushchev into a corner, which led him to put those missiles in Cuba.
It's a scary thought.
It is.
How close we've come to nuclear war and how easily it could happen again.
And they're especially critical of the U.S. doctrine of first use.
Right, that the U.S. reserves the right to use nuclear weapons first.
Even in a non-nuclear conflict.
Yeah.
It's a terrifying thought.
And then they talk about climate change, which they see as a direct result of U.S. economic and foreign policy.
They're very critical of the U.S. record on climate change.
They blame corporate influence and political apathy for the lack of action.
They point to the U.S. withdrawal from the Kyoto Protocol.
And the continued reliance on fossil fuels as evidence of this failure.
Yeah, they see it as a moral failure.
To address this crisis.
Absolutely.
It's a powerful indictment of the system.
It is.
And its inability to respond to one of the greatest challenges.
They see it as a systemic problem
facing humanity.
Right. The system is just not equipped to deal with this kind of long-term existential threat.
It's like they're saying our short-term thinking is going to be our downfall.
That's a good way to put it.
And then they get to what I think is the most thought-provoking part of the book, which is where they talk about the domestic roots of U.S. foreign policy.
This is where they really connect the dots between domestic and foreign policy.
They argue that in a society like the U.S., where you have such extreme inequality, foreign policy often serves the interests of the elite.
The wealthy and powerful.
Right, not the public good.
The average person.
It challenges this idea that U.S. foreign policy is about altruism and spreading democracy.
That it's about helping others.
Right.
They say that's a myth.
And they point out that public opinion is often opposed to U.S. foreign policy.
On things like the Iraq War aid to Israel. But it's routinely ignored by policymakers.
Yeah, they cite all these polls and studies that show this disconnect.
Like a huge disconnect.
Between what the people want and what the government does.
It's like the government is operating in a completely different reality.
And they also expose these mechanisms of propaganda and information control that are used to manufacture consent for these policies.
To make people believe that these policies are in their best interest.
Even when they're not.
Even when they're harmful.
And they say the media plays a role in this.
Often unknowingly.
Right.
They're not saying there's a conspiracy, but that there's a systemic bias that favors the dominant narratives.
And they give the example of Dick Cheney.
Oh, yeah.
Who, when asked if he cared what the American people thought
about the Iraq War,
simply said no.
No. Just flat out no.
It's pretty chilling.
It is. It shows you how little they care about what the people think.
It really underscores their point that the U.S. is not a truly democratic society.
At least when it comes to foreign policy.
Right. There's this disconnect between the ideals and the reality.
And that disconnect is driven by power.
Right.
The power of the wealthy and the powerful.
So what are we to make of all this? What do Chomsky and Robinson ultimately want us to take away
from this book?
Well, I think their main goal is to make us think critically about U.S. foreign policy.
To question those assumptions.
Exactly.
To look beyond the surface.
And understand how it really works and who benefits from it.
And to recognize that the U.S. is not always the good guy.
That its actions often have devastating consequences for people around the world.
But they don't just leave us with this bleak picture of a rigged system.
They do offer some hope.
Right.
And we'll get into that the next part of our deep dive. So picking up where we left off, Chomsky and Robinson really dig into how this system in the U.S. is structured in a way that makes it really hard for the public to have any influence on foreign policy.
They talk about this revolving door between government and corporations where you've got these key positions being filled by people who have close ties to these powerful interests.
And those interests, they argue, have way too much influence on policy decisions.
And they're not just speculating.
Right.
They actually cite studies that show public opinion often has little to no impact on U.S. foreign policy.
Especially when it comes to things like military intervention or foreign aid.
They mentioned this one study that found that, U.S. foreign policy is most heavily influenced by internationally oriented business leaders, while public opinion has little or no significant effect on government officials.
It really shows you who's calling the shots.
Yeah, it's a pretty clear illustration of that disconnect between what the people want and what the government actually does.
And they don't just stop there. They also dig into the mechanism that are used to shape public perception.
Yeah, like how do they get us to go along with these policies?
Exactly. They talk about manufacturing consent.
It's like we're being manipulated without even realizing it.
And they argue that the media
often plays a role in this.
Okay.
Even if it's unintentional.
They're not saying that the media is controlled by some, evil cabal.
No, it's more subtle than that.
Okay.
It's about a systemic bias that favors the dominant narratives.
So even without a deliberate attempt to mislead, the information we're getting is already filtered in a particular way.
It's framed in a way that aligns with those in power.
They give some interesting examples of this.
They do.
Like how certain terms, like terrorism, are used selectively to label enemies of the U.S.
Right.
while ignoring similar acts committed by the U.S. or its allies.
They make that point about Cuba
Yeah.
being designated as a state sponsor of terror, even though the U.S. has a long history of supporting terrorism against Cuba.
It's a classic double standard.
Yeah, it's a good example of how language is used to shape our perceptions and justify actions.
And they talk about how this bias plays out in the media's coverage of conflicts.
You say there's a hierarchy of victims.
A hierarchy of victims.
Yeah, some lives are seen as more worthy of our attention than others.
That's a disturbing thought.
It is. And they give that example of the CBS correspondent during the Ukraine war.
Oh, yeah?
Who was shocked to see such violence in a civilized European country.
It's like we're conditioned to care more about people who look like us, who live in places that we consider civilized.
And that makes it easier to justify going to war.
Right. If the enemy is seen as less than human.
Less deserving of our sympathy.
Yeah. It's pretty messed up when you think about it.
It is.
But where do we go from here?
Right.
Because they don't just leave us with this depressing picture of a system that's rigged against us.
They do offer some hope.
Okay. What do they suggest?
Well, they start by reminding us that the situation isn't hopeless.
Okay.
They point out that the U.S. has a history of public engagement and activism that has led to real change.
They talk about the movements of the 1960s, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement.
The women's rights movement, all those movements.
They really shook things up and forced the government to respond.
They show that it's possible to mobilize people and demand change.
Even when those in power
exactly, and emphasize that it's not easy.
Right.
It takes work.
Commitment.
Dedication.
Yeah.
A willingness to challenge those in power.
So they're saying that we're not powerless.
We're not.
That we can make a difference.
If we're willing to fight for it.
Okay, so what can we do?
Well, they say education is key. We need to learn to see through the propaganda and understand the real motives behind U.S. foreign policy.
To be critical thinkers. Yeah. Exactly. To question those dominant narratives.
Yeah, to not just accept everything we're told.
Right. And then we need to take action.
Okay.
We need to become active and engaged citizens.
So voting, contacting our representatives. Protesting, supporting organizations that are working for peace and justice.
All that.
It's about more than just changing our minds.
It is.
It's about changing the system itself.
They say change won't come from the top.
Right.
It has to come from the bottom up. It has to come from the people.
What kind of concrete changes do they call for?
Well, they say the U.S. needs to start following international law.
Okay.
Respecting the UN Charter. Accepting the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court.
So holding ourselves accountable.
Exactly. To the same standards we hold others to.
And they also call for a reduction in military spending.
Yeah, a massive reduction. And they say that money should be redirected.
To social programs.
To health, education.
Housing.
So shifting priorities.
Yeah, from militarism to human well-being.
It's a pretty radical idea.
It is. But they argue it's necessary.
And they say the U.S. should prioritize diplomacy over military intervention.
They say we need to stop trying to be the world's policeman.
Right.
And start working cooperatively with other countries.
So moving away from this idea of
exactly.
towards a more multilateral approach.
They even suggest some specific things the U.S. could do to show that it's serious.
Like rejoining the Kyoto Protocol.
Right.
And taking a leadership role on climate change.
So working with other countries to address this global crisis.
Exactly.
It's like they're asking us to rethink our whole approach to the world.
To move away from self-interest and towards a more global perspective.
And they don't just talk about U.S. policy. They also encourage us to look at other examples of more democratic models.
They mention the Zapatistas in Mexico.
Right. And the Kurds in Rojava.
Who are building these alternative societies.
Yeah. Based on direct democracy, communal ownership.
Ecological sustainability.
Yeah. It's about imagining new possibilities.
It's pretty inspiring, actually.
It is.
So we've covered a lot here, from U.S. interventionism to propaganda.
To the possibility of change.
Yeah. What stood out to you the most?
I think for me it's their insistence that we can't just accept the dominant narratives about U.S. foreign policy.
We have to question those narratives.
We have to dig deeper. We have to confront the uncomfortable truths about our country's actions.
And that we have a responsibility to act, to demand better from our leaders, and to work for a better world.
That's what it's all about.
So it's not just about understanding the problem. Yep. It's about taking action to solve it.
Exactly.
And that brings us to a final thought that Chomsky and Robinson leave us with. So what is that final thought? I'm intrigued.
Well, they leave us with a question, actually.
Okay, hit me with it.
They ask, if so many U.S. citizens are against these policies, the wars, the interventions, the support for unsavory regimes, what does that say about democracy in America? Can real change even happen in the system as it is? Or do we need something completely different?
That's a tough one. They're suggesting that if the government keeps doing things the people don't want, maybe the system itself is broken.
Yeah, that's the heart of their critique. They argue that the U.S., for all its talk about democracy, often acts in ways that are pretty undemocratic.
Right.
And they suggest that those traditional ways we think about democracy, like elections and representation and public debate, they've been weakened to the point where they don't really give people a voice anymore.
So it's not just about specific policies. They're questioning the whole system.
The foundation of it.
It really makes you think, if the people don't have the power, then who does?
That's the question they want us to wrestle with. They argue that the U.S. system is tilted towards the wealthy and powerful.
Right.
And that undermines the whole idea of democracy.
It's not a very comforting thought.
No, it's not. But I think it's important to face it head on. If we want to build a better world, we have to be honest about the problems.
It's been a really eye-opening deep dive, I gotta say. I mean, it's made me rethink a lot of what I thought I knew about U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah, it definitely challenges some assumptions.
But it's not all doom and gloom, right? I mean, they do offer some glimmers of hope.
Absolutely. They remind us that change is possible. We've seen it happen before.
Yeah.
Think about all the social movements throughout history that have pushed for progress. They also emphasize the importance of education, critical thinking, being informed, and not just taking things at face value.
Yeah, and being engaged.
Right. Get involved in your community. Support organizations that are working for positive change.
It's a call to action.
It is. We have a responsibility to make our voices heard.
So what's the one thing you hope our listener takes away from all this?
I'd say it's that idea of empowered skepticism. Don't just accept what you're told. Question everything, dig deeper, and don't be afraid to demand better.
I love that. Empowered skepticism. That's a great way to put it. And if you're listening and you want to learn more, definitely check out the full book, The Myth of American Idealism. It's dense, but so worth it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better world.